Welcome everyone, Christine here to talk about the most powerful ranged races in Total War Warhammer 3 Immortal Empires, starting with the Dark Elves, though I admit I was tempted to remove them from this video after only 2% of people voted for them in the poll. Though I think that has more to do not with the range power capability of the Dark Elves, but rather how people view the Dark Elves in general. And I'm a bit confused, I admit, on that. Dark Elves have the ability of gaining a lot of money in their economy. Their base economic building can generate them 700 income. Their ports can generate a pretty decent amount of income as well. Yes, you do have to deal with the slave mechanic, but you're not going to run out of slaves in a Dark Elf campaign. Not that easily, certainly. They can recruit a lot of units and maintain a lot of armies with their Black Arcs. So I guess the question is, why do people hate the Dark Elves so much? They have powerful armies, the ability to recruit a lot of units very quickly with the Black Arcs, and of course local recruitment as well. Yes, they don't have global recruitment. Yes, they have limitations, but they also have a great deal of strength. So let me know in the comment section why you dislike the Dark Elves. If you do dislike them, what are your issues with them? Because it does seem like a lot of people do dislike them. Now, from a ranged situation with the Dark Elves, we have the following choices. At tier 1, you get Dark Shards. If you're talking about the Black Arc Corsair, of course, you're going to get Black Arc Corsairs with hand bows as well early on in your campaign, though that's not really a ranged unit, that's a melee hybrid unit with a ranged attack. It's really the Dark Shards, and in particular the Dark Shards with shields at tier 2, that are really powerful. A great deal of armor piercing, multiple projectiles. Yes, short range, but you have a silver shield, and 125 range is not necessarily something to sneeze at either. You do need to get closer than some other races do in order to do damage, but you are capable of doing a significant amount of damage and also taking quite a bit of return fire in exchange. But that's not the only choice you have in terms of ranged units or ranged unit doomstacks. Now, if you're playing a Dark Elf, by the way, you're going to be much better off in your campaign getting a lot of Black Arc Corsairs, just because the melee meta is certainly more powerful in a lot of ways than the ranged meta in the campaign. Like, throw a bunch of Black Arc Corsairs in a siege, throw them at the gates, and they'll win through a lot of enemies because they have the stats to be able to do so. But you do have the strength, you do have a lot of range strength to also make a ranged playstyle work as the Dark Elves. You also get Shades at tier 2, which don't have the same kind of survivability as Dark Shards with shields, but they do have a bit more range and they can do more damage. And they have a lot of armor piercing damage, so Shades and Dark Shards can be really effective against units of every kind of tier. They'll be less effective than some other range units at an early tier, but against like Warriors of Chaos or highly armored units in general, they'll do amazing. I admit I don't necessarily see the point in Shades with dual weapons or Shades with greatswords unless you're going to be using them in melee, which is kind of besides the point. Shades are a ranged unit. They're not really a melee unit, though funnily enough they're better than the vast majority of hybrid units that Kislev has, because take these guys against like armored Khazars, and I think they'd win in melee, let alone winning in ranged, hands down, but they'd probably win in melee pretty easily as well. They don't have the same level of armor, but they do have some fairly substantial melee stats as well when it comes down to it. Those aren't the only ranged options, of course, as the Dark Elves. You do have Dark Riders or Repeater Crossbows. I wouldn't necessarily use them just because there's so many sieges in the game, but they do have a decent amount of power and they can run in circles around your enemies, harass enemies. Skirmisher Cavalry, a couple of Skirmisher Cavalry units can be very useful in battles because yes, they can run around in circles, around the enemy in battles. And one of the things you can also do, if you have Dark Riders or any kind of Skirmisher Cavalry, let's say you're fighting an offensive battle, right? But the enemy might beat you in an open field or it might not be a favorable exchange. Well, one of the things that you do is you corner camp or you put your army in a favorable terrain and then you send Skirmisher Cavalry units or mages and you harass the enemy. Dark Riders work better than mages in a lot of ways, just because they can keep shooting. You send them towards an enemy army, you find the weak point, you harass them, and you lure the enemy into attacking you. And that's their strength. And then, of course, we also have the Medusae available. Not necessarily a huge amount of armor, but still a fairly good amount of missile strength, capability of doing quite a bit of damage. I would consider the Medusae more of an artillery unit as well. By the way, I want to emphasize that I'm not necessarily focusing on artillery capability in this video. I'm focusing on ranged combat ability, not artillery. Artillery, I think, is its own category when we're talking about the power of individual races. I do consider it to a certain extent. The artillery of Dark Elves certainly isn't the strongest, but they won't necessarily suffer in a campaign because of it. At least when it comes to a lot of the battles they'll fight, though you certainly are lacking the capability of destroying walls and destroying wall towers very quickly, but it doesn't matter, because you have the ability of winning a lot of battles with either a ranged army, or a melee army, or a combination of both if you're playing as the Dark Elves. At number 4, we have Grand Cathay. I'm sure a lot of people will ask, well, why isn't Kislev on this list? Well, because while Kislev does have some pretty good early game range units, late game they do struggle. Spell Sieges struggle because of the inherent issues gunpowder units have at the moment, and they also struggle because Ice Guard just aren't really good end game range units. Meanwhile, you have Grand Cathay when it comes to range units. How would I describe Grand Cathay? Well, I would probably describe them as being very similar to Dwarves in a lot of ways, but better. Yes, the harmony system isn't the great system, but I'd rather take the harmony system with a 40 growth if I get perfect harmony than the issues the dwarves have to deal with in their campaign. But in quite a few ways, at least in terms of battle playstyle, they can be very similar to dwarves because they're really about the combination of infantry and artillery and ranged units moving together as one united block and just killing everything from ranged. And here's the thing about Grand Cathay. There's a lot of powerful units you can get through just your regular barracks chain. Some of the best units you can get in your campaign for just getting a tier 3 barracks. So you're talking about Jade Warriors, heavily armored units, good leadership, not necessarily the best melee stats, but really capable of holding the line. Then we're talking about Jade Warrior crossbowmen, which have a lot of armor, which always counts for any units, a great deal of range, not necessarily the highest damage, but certainly a great deal of survivability. And then, of course, Jade Warrior crossbowmen with shields. It's not a silver shield, it's not Dark Shard level, but it's still fairly substantial. And then moving on, of course, we do have some other choices as well if you are playing as Grand Cathay. Iron Hail Gunners, believe it or not, are actually a very effective unit right now. Yes, they're a gunpowder unit, but the thing is, they're a gunpowder unit with a very short range, but that can pack a very heavy punch when it comes to that. And I think that's really what makes Iron Hail Gunners work. Yes, you do need to get them pretty close to the enemy, but a couple of these guys will do a significant amount of damage in a battle, because you're not really using them like some long range, like handgunners or as Streltsy. You're using them like a short range shotgun unit, and the short range means they're going to have fewer issues than many of the other gunpowder units. You still need to give them a clear line of sight. They can struggle in sieges, but they can do a significant amount of damage when they do get those shots off. That's the thing with gunpowder units. They struggle to get their shots off, and when they shoot, they're not necessarily doing so much damage. Then, of course, you have grain gunners. Very long range, and surprisingly that long range is really what helps them out, because while they will certainly struggle like other gunpowder units, they can hit from so far across the battlefield that they're likely going to hit something during the course of the battle. Like, I wouldn't use armies of Iron Hail Gunners or Crane Gunners, but I would have a couple of these units in my armies because I think they can be effective. But really, the main range power, the strongest range power for Grand Cathay comes from the Celestial Dragon Guard. High level of armor, good range, high level of damage, the battle harmony, which is always useful to have in a battle if you have some melee units around them. Bronze shield, it should be a silver shield for such a high tier unit. For a tier 5 unit, can be difficult to get access to them, but the power is there. And as Grand Cathay, you certainly have a good enough economy to be able to afford these units. And you have flying artillery units. So I don't necessarily like the Sky Junks. I much rather have Fire Rain rockets and Grand Cannons as opposed to Sky Junks. I just think like Sky Junks can do a lot of damage, but when you're looking at the stats, right? The Fire Rain rocket just has a bit extra range, same missile strength when we're looking at it. The Sky Junk does have more ammunition, so it has that going for it, but yeah, I'd rather take the ground-based artillery that Grand Cathay does have in their arsenal when it comes down to it. But it's like, it just feels like I'm playing like a race of dwarves, because that's kind of really how it feels with Grand Cathay, because they have the really powerful crossbowmen units of the dwarves, though, yeah, dwarves have better crossbow units, but you have easier access as Grand Cathay because you're not limited by growth. You are limited, however, in casualty replenishment, unfortunately, like the dwarves, but that is a playstyle that works pretty well. And we also shouldn't ignore that they do have peasant archers from every settlement. Now, I would personally say that unless you're in an emergency, peasant archers are not necessarily worth recruiting. Like over here, I would only recruit 2 of them if I just want to get some extra range units. Though really what would be worth him more would be to get some regular Jade Warriors here, just because I start with tier 1 settlement over here as Miao Ying. Just my perspective. I think Grand Cathay has a pretty powerful ranged army, and it works really well with their legendary lords as well, because you send those legendary lords, you throw those legendary lords in the middle of the battlefield. While Miao Ying doesn't have regeneration, and she can struggle in terms of survival to a certain extent, she still will survive quite a few units of hurling themselves against her. And she can always escape a lot of battlefields because she's a flying unit. So you throw them in, you use your ranged units and your artillery to annihilate enemy armies. Good amount of range strength for Grand Cathay. We have the High Elves, though of course it depends on which High Elven Legendary Lord you're talking about. Elfarion has his Mistwalkers, Alariel has her focus on the Sisters of Avalorn, and of course Alifanar has his Shadow Warriors and Shadow Walkers. But even baseline High Elves with just the usage of archers with light armor is still pretty strong. I wouldn't use regular archers, I would use archers with light armor. That extra armor, that extra 25 armor does make a hell of a difference in a lot of battles. It means they can take a lot more range fire, makes them effective. Now, the thing about the High Elven range roster is as follows. At a low level, at any settlement, you can recruit regular archers. Obviously, archers with light armor are better, but just the ability of recruiting archers from any settlement is a significant strength. Now, archers have a great deal of range, one of the highest, actually, of any ranged unit in the game. They don't have a great deal of armor piercing, but they will be able to do a significant amount of damage from range against pretty much any enemy that you will encounter, unless we're talking about heavily armored enemies in a campaign. And here's the interesting thing in a High Elven campaign. You don't necessarily have to deal with some very high level of armor on your enemies until much later on in virtually every single one of your campaigns, unless you're talking about Black Ark Corsairs if you're playing as Alifanar. Outside of that, many of the enemies you'll be dealing with in virtually every High Elven campaign will have relatively low levels of armor, so the archers work very well for virtually every High Elven campaign. I mean, I guess maybe Teclis to some extent, but if he's dealing with a lot of Forsaken from Kairos Fateweaver, but that's probably really the exception. Yes, Warriors of Chaos can become an issue later on, but none of the High Elven Legendary Lords start so close to Warriors of Chaos. Now, later on, you do have some other choices as well, because you do get the Lavern Seaguard with shields or without shields, silver shields, decent level of armor, lower range, but still a decent amount of range damage over there, and a good amount of survivability. And really, the Lavern Seaguard can replace your Spearman as the front line, or you can just use the regular Seaguard without shields. Pretty effective units, not as good, I would say, as archers, a bit more expensive, so not as effective to be able to mass them in large numbers, but still works pretty well. They do have some skirmisher cavalry units with the Lyrian Reaver archers over here, so that can be pretty effective. And of course, they have the Sisters of Avalorn at tier 4, or at tier 3 if you're playing Lariel. And of course, there's the Mistwalkers for Elfarion, there's the Shadow Walkers for Alifanar. Now, Sisters of Avalorn are great for dealing with the endgame issues because they do have a great deal of armor piercing damage. They're a bit costly, so you may not want to maintain full stacks of them, maybe a couple of them in every army, just to be able to deal with some very high armored targets, whereas regular archers will be able to deal with a lot of those issues. Then, of course, you do have Shadow Warriors as a tier 3 infantry for every High Elven Legendary Lord. They're just slightly better than archers when it comes to it, just more costly, lower armor, a bit lower armor, but of course they can fire while moving. And the ability to fire while moving is actually a significant strength for any kind of ranged unit, just because you can go in there, do a lot of damage, and then get out. Just keep kiting the enemy if you're playing with Shadow Warriors, and they won't be able to really catch up to you, because you do have a decent amount of speed on these guys, higher than the speed of a lot of like heavily armored units they might struggle against. They do lack the high level of armor piercing damage to be effective against high armor targets, but they are still pretty effective in battle. Just play a campaign as Alifanar, you'll figure out what I mean about that very, very quickly. And those are the ranged options of the High Elves, with the exception of like some of the unique units. Some of the Legendary Lords do get access to in their campaigns. Good amount of power, and what really works for the High Elves is like basically every single army can be a combination of spearmen and archers, and they will be effective against the vast majority of threats you will be encountering in a campaign. You may want some siege though, you may want to have a couple of siege units. It's a bit annoying getting Eagle Claw bolt throwers as the High Elves. If there's any major issue I would say that exists with the High Elves is they only have one artillery unit, and it requires a tier 3 settlement to be able to get them, and you're wasting a structure slot just to be able to get them. Because the other units that you get from this building chain are not really worth getting in your campaign. Does improve your local recruitment capacity if you get it, and does give you military advancements, but I'm not too fond of having to get this building chain in my campaign. That's the only issue the High Elves have when it comes to like range prowess, but they do have some really powerful ranged infantry units in the course of their campaign. At number 2, it is the Skaven with a quarter of the vote on the poll. Now, I do wonder with the Skaven whether or not I should consider the Deathglow Bombardiers as artillery units or as missile infantry units. The game does consider the Deathglow Bombardiers as missile infantry. They consider the Poison Wind Globadiers as well as missile infantry. So I guess that's what we're going with. Well, these guys are ridiculous. I would have placed Skaven high up on this list even if I counted these guys as artillery, so not necessarily counting as much for this list, but if the game is counting them as missile infantry, then fair enough. The thing about these units here, these 3 units here in particular, they're ridiculous. The amount of damage these guys can do in a battle is absurd, even by the standards of ranged units in Total War Warhammer 3. You want to see a unit that when it fires, it just wipes out half a stack in a single shot? That's what the Skaven can do with these units. Especially the Deathglow Bombardiers and the Poison Wind Mortars is absurd. Poison Wind Globadiers, less power, but still fairly significant. And of course, if you are playing as Claw, you can buff them up as well. With you can buff up the Wind Mortars and the Globadiers and Bombardiers over here. So you can get more missile strength, you can get fear for them. It's a bit weird to give them melee attack and armor piercing damage, but I guess it does work. And you can get bonus versus large armor ammo for those units as well. Now the Poison Wind Mortars, they do get reload time reduction. They get Pestilent Wind ammunition, which does damage over time and reduces leadership, and you get an extra range benefit for them as well. But those aren't the only ranged units that they have. They also have the Warp Fire Throwers, which are pretty effective flamethrowers if you can get them to actually shoot. Flamethrowers do have some issues. Then, of course, there is the Rattling Gunners and Jezzails. I would say Rattling Gunners are pretty worthless right now. They're pretty bad in a siege. They struggle to get shots off even on an open ground, even on the perfect battlefield. So, not really great units to use. Jezzails, on the other hand, are a bit of a different discussion because they have a very high level of range. They will be able to get a decent number of shots off. And here's the thing about the Rattling Gunners, though, and the Jezzails, they have high levels of armor, so they can actually do pretty well in an auto-resolve. So you might just actually use them for the auto-resolve benefit, because actually having some heavily armored Skaven units is not necessarily all that common. One of the problems the Skaven do face in their campaigns is their poor auto-resolve. Well, you won't have poor auto-resolve with very high armored units. Though you may struggle with Doom Wheels taking a ridiculous amount of damage as well. But really, the true range strength of the Skaven isn't from these units. These units can be difficult to acquire. Even as the Skaven, yes, you can use a lot of food and get the tier 5 settlement, but it's going to take time to be able to unlock these units properly. The real range power of the Skaven starts at tier 2 with the Hidden Lair, because that's when you get Night Runners and, crucially, Night Runners with slings. Now, Night Runners with slings aren't the best range units when it comes to their stats, but here's the thing. They have the ability of... They have Vanguard deployment. They have physical resistance, so they can take quite a bit of damage. They get a leadership benefit if their leadership is dropping. And the way these guys work is that you're running around the battlefield, you're running around the entire battlefield with these guys, just doing damage to the enemy while the enemy is trying to chase you down. That is a significant amount of power that you do have available. It's what makes Axiatl so powerful, it's what makes Alifanar so powerful, and every Skaven Legendary Lord has that ability, and it's pretty powerful. Now, Deathmaster Snitch has the best of these guys because he gets an armor piercing benefit to them. So their armor piercing isn't necessarily the best. But then at tier 3, you get Gutter Runners. Now, the difference between Gutter Runners and Night Runners is these guys have stock. So they're just the better version of those units because they have stock, so they start out invisible, they do more damage. They're just gonna have a much better time. Like the Gutter Runner Slingers, they do a bit more damage, they have stock. They're just gonna handle themselves much better than regular Night Runners in a battle. Still pretty low range, sure, but they can get very close to the enemy, and they can also lower their speed with the Snare Net. And of course, you'd also have the poisoned version of these guys, which just basically adds a poison attack, which will lower the speed of enemies even further. Though, of course, the poisoned units do require you to get the Pestilent Knave in order to be able to use them, but still a great deal of power. And the thing about these units is they're actually pretty decent in melee as well. Like, that's the thing about Gutter Runners and Gutter Runners with slings, is that they're pretty decent melee units. Like, they're certainly capable of standing up to a unit like Clan Rats and being able to win. May not necessarily have as much armor, but when we're talking about other melee stats, like when we're thinking about melee attack or some other benefits that they might have, like if we compare a Night Runner to a Clan Rat, there's a lot of similarities, but when it comes to their melee ability, but obviously you have a bit more leadership, a bit lower armor, but you're obviously going to do some damage. And you do have that physical resistance that the Clan Rats don't have. So those are the Skaven options when it comes to it. Like Night Runners, Gutter Runners are pretty damn good. You can obviously use some Jezzails for their long-range combat ability, and of course the Globadiers, Bombardiers, and Poison Wind Mortars being pretty effective ranged units as well. If you're counting them as being ranged units and not artillery units. But the thing about it is, even if you're not counting these guys as artillery units, Skaven do have some really good artillery units as dedicated artillery units as well. Like the Plague Claw catapults are absurd. They can be dodged, but they're pretty absurd. Then you have, of course, Warp Lightning Cannons, which can deal a significant amount of damage to, like, some large targets, can deal some significant damage to, like, walls, wall towers will do pretty well. But just getting an artillery unit that's as powerful as the Plague Claw at tier 3 is really absurd in Skaven campaigns. Finally, at number 1, with 50% of the vote, and I don't think any poll I've done on a race or faction in the game has been so one-sided, but of course we have the Wood Elves. It makes sense, the Wood Elves have some really powerful ranged options and some really powerful campaign mechanics. Now, here's the thing. At tier 1, from any tree settlement, you get the ability to recruit Basic Glade Guard. Now, Basic Glade Guard, they're basically like High Elven Archers, the regular ones, the ones without armor, but just better than they are. Certainly better in the long term because they have better armor piercing. They're going to do better when it comes to armor piercing. They can fire while moving. And that is always a strength because you can kite your enemy to death when it comes down to it. Beyond that, you of course get the ability of recruiting Glade Guard with Hagbane Tips and the ability of recruiting Glade Guard with Starfire Shafts. Though of course you are going to need a certain structure to be able to get the Starfire Shafts, but you can get the Hagbane Tips regardless. Now the Hagbane Tips basically are Glade Guard with poison on their attacks. Always great, especially if you're talking about a unit. Like, this increases their armor, they're going to do better in armor piercing, they're going to reduce the combat ability of their enemies, and they can still shoot while moving. So they can kite their enemies to death using the Hagbane Tips. Then, if you do get the Astray Forge, you can get the Starfire Shafts. And the shafts over there make most of their damage being armor piercing. This means they can deal with enemies that have a high level of armor very, very effectively. And just keep in mind, we're basically talking about tier 1 units over here. They're a bit more expensive than some of the other choices that I've had on this list. Some of these units can be more expensive. But even the regular Glade Guards, which certainly aren't more expensive than other units that I've had in this video, are still very effective. The Starfire Shafts are like, oh, you're dealing with Warriors of Chaos, here's your solution to that. Now, beyond that, at tier 2, you also get the ability of recruiting Deepwood Scouts and Deepwood Scouts with Swift Shiver arrows. Now, Deepwood Scouts, the regular one, they have good range. they can shoot while moving, they have Vanguard deployment, and they have stock. So there's just basically a better version of the Glade Guard. More expensive though, but just better stats all around when it comes to regular Glade Guard. The Swift Shiver Deepwood Scouts are, however, a bit ridiculous. They have a large 2 projectiles, do better damage, lower range, sure, but they're doing magical attacks. So these guys are a bit ridiculous. Like they're basically your short range skirmisher infantry unit if you're playing as the Wood Elves. And then finally at tier 4 you have the Way Watchers. The Way Watchers are the best range unit in the Wood Elven roster. They have stock, they can fire while moving, they have Vanguard deployment, they do a ridiculous amount of damage, and most of it is armor piercing. Like if you want a unit to just eliminate any kind of enemy in the game from ranged, the Way Watchers are your choice. Their armor is low, but because they have stock, they can certainly run in circles around their enemy. Now, those aren't necessarily the only options. The only ranged options that you have is the Wood Elves. Those are your main options, the ones you should use in virtually every campaign, but you do have some other choices as well if you're playing as the Wood Elves. You do have the Glade Riders. The Glade Riders, in particular, the range version of the Glade Riders, because these guys can also do a fairly good amount of damage when it comes to it, and really run in circles around the enemy, shoot while moving, hiding in forest, being able to do a good amount of damage. The Hagbane Tip version, of course, does poison damage. And then moving on to a higher level, we get the Sisters Thorn. Low range, sure, but a pretty good amount of damage when we're looking at it. The ability, and with the Hex, and having melee damage reflection, Vanguard deployment, really good skirmisher units when it comes to it. Then, of course, you have the Hawk Riders. Now, regular Hawk Riders can do a decent amount of damage, but of course, they're not necessarily so significantly better than your ground-based units. And the thing about flying units is that they can be very, very vulnerable to return fire from enemy ranged, because there's not necessarily many models in these guys. But then you play the Sisters of Twilight, and you get a cruise missile on every Hawk Rider unit. That's where it gets a bit ridiculous, because that cruise missile, that Volley of Kurnos, does a ridiculous level of damage. And with the Sisters of Twilight, you start with the ability of using 1. Then you get the skill over here, which gives you an extra ability usage for the Volley of Kurnos, which means you get 2 cruise missile for every Hawk Rider in every battle. You want to talk about range power? Yeah, the Wood Elves win hands down. I don't care how powerful Poison Wind Mortars are or Poison Wind Globadiers are, when you can just throw a Hawk Rider unit to kill them before they even can get in range to shoot. That is the power that the Wood Elves have at their disposal, especially as the Sisters of Twilight. But actually, any Wood Elven faction can recruit Hawk Riders. It's not exclusive to the Sisters. They just will be missing that cruise missile, so you won't necessarily be getting a lot of them. But just having that kind of flying harass capability that the Wood Elves have for the Hawk Riders is really powerful. The Dwarves wish that their gyrocopters were as good as baseline Hawk Riders, and Dwarves weep in envy at what the Sisters of Twilight have with their own Hawk Riders over there. And that's the list. Cosine here signing out. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and enable notifications, and stay tuned for more.